All right, welcome back to class. This is Introduction to American, or to, I keep saying American, I got used to teaching American American federal government. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. My name is Ken Hicks, and we've been talking about the democratic ideal, recognizing that democracy in theory sounds great, but democracy in practice oftentimes has problems. And my kind of overarching theme for democracy is that democracy is as good as the people practicing it. And so today the main things we're going to be talking about is we're going to continue our discussion of the emergence of republicanism as a distinctive form of democratic theory. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the spread of democracy and kind of democratic ideas and principles. And then we'll talk about democracy again as an ideal and contrast that with the somewhat less than ideal practice. Then we're going to discuss three conceptions of democracy, and then we'll conclude with a discussion of the demands of democracy. Does democracy require a certain amount of tolerance? So democracy and republic, again, it's very important to recognize that many of the ideas in what we call the Atlantic Republican tradition emerged in England, and emerged as a result of England's very tempestuous history and numerous civil wars. In particular, the English, Civil War of the early modern period that resulted in the beheading of Charles I. Really, again, you think, well, they cut the guy's head off. That's not a very tolerant act. But ultimately, these are some of the things that happen that increasingly push people in the idea, in the direction of a more responsive and accountable government, a government that reflects the will of the people rather than the will of some narrow political elite, at least again, ideally. So the politics of the English Civil War can be boiled down to this. You had Henry VIII, who basically became a Protestant and turned the Catholic Church in England of England into the Episcopalian or Anglican Church, and then you had in the aftermath, as the Tudor line faded and the return of the Stuarts to the crown, you had a Catholic monarchy and an increasingly Protestant nobility, and that was a sort of natural friction point for conflict. Charles I was among several kings of Europe who wanted to kind of rule in an absolutist manner, and frequently clashed with the Parliament over taxation, and in particular over religious policies. Charles wanted to turn England back into a Catholic state. That was something that the political elites of England were really stridently opposed to. So you had, again, about a 9-year-long English Civil War that fundamentally reoriented politics and society in England. And one of the key things that happened was, again, you had a civil war. The Royalists, who were led by the kings and by King Charles, and certain of the Catholic nobility and whatever folks they could muster, were confronted with the forces of the Parliament, and the Parliament understood that they needed to be on their game as it related to military affairs, and they developed what became known as the New Model Army, which reflected many of the things that were being learned about warfare in Europe. It was a very well-disciplined army, and ultimately they were able to defeat the forces of King Charles. And so you ended up with the leader of Parliament, Oliver Cromwell, basically taking over as Lord Protector of England from 1653 until his death in 1658. It's a relatively short reign, but a very consequential one, where, again, many of the forces in the Parliament were very religiously fundamentalist, if you will. And so a lot of the stuff that they were doing was not particularly popular. And so when he died in 1658, you had a movement back to the Stuarts. But in the meantime, in that 5-year period, you had some really interesting ideas about democratic accountability beginning to circulate within England. And again, a lot of this had to do with the ferment within Protestant sects in England. Okay, England was one of those countries where you didn't just have the church, convert to Protestantism and everybody was fine with it. A lot of kind of schismatic sects emerged: Presbyterianism, Methodism, some really kind of bizarre minor sects emerged, and the dominant theme of the complaint towards the Church of England was this idea of corruption, that the Church of England was basically simply a spiritual enforcer of the will of whoever was the leader of the church. So you begin to have flickers of republicanism in this period, and one of the more notable ones was James Harrington's book, Oceana, that was published in 1656. It was basically a utopian exposition on the establishment of a republic in England. Harrington advocated extensive land redistribution, frequent elections, and term limits on elected officials. Now, around the time of the Restoration, when the Stuarts came back into power, Harrington's work very quickly fell out of favor. And many of his advocates, many of the people who were readers and supporters of his ideas actually left the country for the colonies. And many of those Republican ideas ended up, finding root in the colonies and became sort of the germ of the conflict between the Crown and the colonies about a century later. So in the colonies, it was a hotbed both of religious and political dissent. And this is important because, again, what was happening in England was whenever one of these, whenever the Puritans popped up and made trouble, the English political authorities said, you know what? You can just leave. And so, like, for example, with the Protestants, they originally went to the Netherlands. They went to, the middle countries, if you will, because those countries, those middle states of Belgium and the Netherlands had recently thrown off Spanish rule and were widely viewed as kind of the firmament of religious toleration in England, in Europe at the time. The Puritans did not fit in the middle countries, and so after about 10 years, they left and went to the New World. And again, their particular brand of religious fundamentalism, along with their beliefs about republicanism, helped shape colonial political traditions, and that helped make the colonies a very distinctive political culture. These folks may have considered themselves English men and women, but their political beliefs were rapidly diverging from those of the people still living in England. So you had the establishment of a uniquely set, really, of American, distinctly American political cultures. Really, the South was very different, still very much more aristocratic in their viewpoints. But another important kind of Republican idea is this real hostility to corruption. And again, remember what we said about corruption. It is basically the rule for a narrow set of interests rather than rule, for the good of the whole. And so these ideas had a profound effect on the people who drafted the Constitution. Particularly pictured here is James Madison, who famously said in one of the Federalist Papers, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So the Republican convictions of the Constitution's founders drove them in a direction of seeking to balance powers against powers, to create, the whole idea of the separation of powers, the idea of federalism, the idea of bicameralism. These are all Republican principles, the idea of a separate and independent judiciary. These are fundamentally Republican ideas. And again, I don't mean Republican as in the current Republican Party. I mean Republicanism as in limited government and mixed government. Okay, so there were lots and lots of compromises that had to be made with anti-Republican factions. Again, as I mentioned, the South, many of the most consequential revisions of the Constitution, the compromises that were made to accommodate slavery. The fact that they allowed the slave trade to continue for 20 years after ratification. The fact of the 3/5 compromise that dramatically expanded the representational power of Southern states in the House of Representatives. The Second Amendment was basically a post-ratification way of mollifying the southern states, because again, the fear was, because Article 1 of the Constitution basically gives to the House of Representatives and to the Congress generally the power to raise and support armies and to draft rules for their conduct. The southern states were like, no, we need to be able to have our own militia to put down slave rebellions, and we need an armed militia. And that was the rationale behind the Second Amendment, not this insistence that every human being be able to run around armed to the teeth, as we commonly interpret that amendment today. And so again, the rough and tumble nature of the ratification debates, kind of demonstrated the untidy nature of democratic discourse. And again, we look at, today a lot of people say, well, America is a liberal country, liberal in the sense that we are a country that focuses on individual rights. And we'll talk more about that in next week when we start our discussion of liberalism. But in fact, there were lots and lots of illiberal and frankly anti-liberal and anti-democratic elements of American, colonial life. And again, much of it located in the South. But also there was a merchant class in the North that had sort of aristocratic ideas about how the world should operate. And so you have the birth of what we call the spirit of faction. You had Federalists who basically dominated for the period after ratification. You also had Washington's two-term decision, basically the idea that, he basically said 8 years is enough for anyone, okay? And you had the emergence of durable state and regional partisanship as the Federalists emerged very powerful in the Northeast, and ultimately what would become the Democratic Republicans in the South. One of the most significant things that happened in American history that really set us down a democratic path was the election of 1800. Why is that so important? It was the first time you had an incumbent president lose and then subsequently peacefully surrender power. That was an enormously consequential decision that John Adams made at great personal sacrifice. And it was one of the most important decisions that is not often given the significance it should be. He should be lauded for his willingness to follow the will of the people. So let's talk a little bit about John Adams. He was again one of the more influential members of the founding generation. He served in any number of the big constitutional congresses during the war. He was minister to France in the immediate aftermath of the war. He was not at the Constitutional Convention, like Thomas Jefferson, for the same reasons. Adams was in England, Jefferson was in France as U.S. ministers to those countries when the Constitutional Convention took place. We're going to talk a little bit about an excerpt from the works of John Adams. Most of his work is what we would call epistolary in nature. He's writing letters to fellow high-ranking Americans and influential Americans. And so he was a lawyer by trade. He actually defended British soldiers who had been accused during the Boston Massacre. And he was, again, a very high-ranking guy. He was George Washington's. He finished second in the elections of 1888 and 1892, and so served as George Washington's vice president. He was elected president in 1896. or 1796, with Thomas Jefferson, his avowed rival, although they had been friends previously, but they were rivals, and ultimately that caused us to amend the Constitution to give the members of the Electoral College a vote for both president and vice president, so we wouldn't have rivals, because it worked so poorly. Jefferson and Adams at that point in their lives really despised one another. So he begins with an idea of flattery, right? From Alexander Pope, who was of a famous English poet of the 18th century. For forms of government, let fools contest. That which is best administered is best. Adams is offering disagreement and basically saying that all sober inquiries conclude happiness and dignity consist in virtue, and governments founded on fear are so sordid and brutal that no American would find acceptable. And so therefore any candid mind would conclude a republican government is best, an empire of laws and not of men. So necessary first steps for a republican form of government. First of all, you have to have representative bodies. And Adams ruminates on the difficulties inherent in selecting representative bodies that will both kind of express the virtues of a populace, but at the same time, kind of minimize the defects of a populace. And so first he talks about a unicameral, the idea of a single legislature. And he points to a number of problems inevitable that occur within unicameral legislatures, including that a single legislature is prone to all the vices, follies, and frailties of an individual. Second, a single assembly is prone to avarice and over time will not scruple to exempt itself from burdens. Three, a single assembly will often grow ambitious and after time will not hesitate to vote its seats to be permanent and not vulnerable. This is actually something that has occurred in the history of Republican governance. Fourth, a representative assembly will prove unfit to exercise executive powers because legislative bodies can't keep secrets and they can't act quickly. Fifth, a representative assembly is unqualified to exercise judicial power because it is too numerous, too slow, and too little skilled in the laws. And then finally, because it is a single assembly, it is liable to make arbitrary laws for their own interest, execute all laws arbitrarily in the service of their own interests, and judge all controversies in their favor. And so he is basically making an argument for the separation of powers. And this is an important kind of preface, because he's really writing as the Constitutional Convention is kind of forming. It's and he's writing over that summer while that convention is meeting. He discusses the problem of judicial power and the need for a distinct assembly as a mediator between the legislative and the executive. Again, kind of foreshadowing the existence of a separate judiciary. And then finally talks about, he concludes, we need a bicameral legislature. He talks about the idea that we should have annual elections, right? He has, there is the old slogan, the old Republican slogan, where annual elections end, there slavery begins. He argues that annual elections would teach political leaders the great political virtues of humility, patience, and moderation, without which every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. Think about how people who are not afraid of re-election can behave. He also talks about term limits, which at the time was known as rotation in office. He talked about the importance for governors, which I think he didn't understand what the new executive's name would be, but believed that the head of the government should have the power to command the militia and all military forces. And he also approved of executive nomination of judicial, executive, and civil officers subject to the advice and consent of counsel. Now again, this is someone who was not at the Constitutional Convention at the time, but is nevertheless tapping into all of the things that those guys talked about. Okay? And really kind of reflecting on the sense in which American political culture was almost destined to produce something like the Constitution, because those ideas were so deeply embedded in those people who who were politically experienced. And one of the great blessings that occurred with our independence was that we did have a fairly large, fairly young set of political elites that were also extraordinarily well experienced. People who had served in the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, who had served in state governments, who had served in the Continental Congress. And part of the reason for that was a political culture that accepted Republican principles and that believed in accountable government. And that's the reason why we had such an experienced political class at that time. So let's move on and talk a little bit about kind of American experience with democracy. One of the most acute observers of American democracy was a Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a member of the French kind of nobility that survived the French Revolution. He came to the United States ostensibly to study the American penal system. How did American juries and courts and prisons actually work? Instead, he wrote a multi-volume book, a two-volume book called Democracy in America. And again, one of the keys that he wrote about was this idea of that democracy tended to have innately egalitarian features. And so he used this phrase, the habits of the heart. He believed first and foremost that democracy was the wave of the future, that democracy would spread rapidly because it was inclusive and because people yearned for both the freedom to not be subjected to political coercion, but also to have a say in political issues that touched on them. So the basic challenge that Tocqueville saw was that because democracy celebrates equality, it tends to promote mediocrity. And that produces the threat of the tyranny of the majority. So what he saw, and again, this is a French nobleman wandering around the American states in the 1820s. For him, the remedy was participation in public affairs, which inculcates the virtues of compromise and cooperation, which again he described as the habits of the heart. By becoming active in public affairs, by joining political clubs, clubs that might have the mayor of a town alongside of a janitor serving as officers of that club. It really did instill in people that sense of commonness, of common purpose that is so essential to the sustaining democratic communities. So this great democratic wave that he spoke of, he saw the daily advance of democratic conditions. He talks about the origins of democratic sentiments, again in this sense in which people are dealing with their day-to-day public affairs in a democratic fashion. And he notes that there were several historical factors that had lent impetus to this leveling moment. The Crusades, the advent of capitalism, the advent of firearms. When you think about it, what do guns do? Well, they render armor obsolete, right? Because any peasant with a rifled musket can take down a knight in shining armor, right? Guns are the great leveling force of the battlefield. And so Tocqueville basically comments that any attempt to check democracy would be to resist the will of God. So what is the first duty of democratic governance? It is to educate. He talks about the idea of a new science of politics that is needed for the new world. You don't want to abandon the masses to their impulses. Great quotation here. Men are not corrupted by the exercise of power or debased by the habit of obedience, but by the exercise of power which they believe to be illegal, and by the obedience to a rule which they consider to be usurped and oppressive. When you think about the things that have driven people to revolutions of the past, it's to consistently voicing dissent and to having their voices stilled. And it is, to being arbitrarily forced to do things that they don't want to do. So Tocqueville has sort of an ambivalent attitude towards democracy. He basically says the democratic state there will be less splendor, but also less misery. And he talks about the strange confusion of a transitional age from more feudal times to more democratic times. He would say the spell of royalty is broken, but it has not been succeeded by the majesty of the laws. The people have learned to despise all authority. Think about how that applies. A lot of conservatives love Tocqueville because of his warnings about the masses, about an unleavened mass of people who are, kind of driven by grievance and uneducated in the workings of the world. Tocqueville would say the poor man retains the prejudice of his forefather without their faith. Right, the loss of religious faith as a basis of social organization is a poignant loss to Tocqueville. Inevitably, you're going to see the emergence of intense conflict. The religionists are the enemies of liberty, and the friends of liberty attack religion. Right? Many people would contend that both socialism and liberalism, Enlightenment ideologies, are innately hostile to religion. And to some extent that may be true, certainly of some variants of socialism. But there are also many religious variants of socialism, just as there were and are devout liberals in the world. What they tended to resist was religion exercising secular authority. Tocqueville would conclude, I cannot believe that the Creator made man to leave him in an endless struggle with the intellectual miseries which surround us. Many of these miseries exist to this day. Many of our conflicts are between those people who are, religiously devout and those folks who are not, and who are not persuaded that they should be forced to do as their religiously devout demand. These are fundamental conflicts. So over time, these ideas about democracy begin to diffuse. They begin to spread rather widely. People began reading about democracy in the 19th century, really in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and well into the 20th centuries. There are a number of factors that contributed to the spread of democracy as a governing principle. But the main ones are the idea, first, of self-protection, but also of self-development. And let's talk a little bit about each of those in turn. A variety of sociological factors, kind of contributed to the spreading belief in democracy. Sociological factors include industrialization and the resulting urbanization of many developing advanced economies in the United States and Europe, the diffusion of public education to better prepare workers for an increasingly complex workplace in an industrialized economy, improvements in communication and transportation, and a growing conviction that commoners were capable of the basic tasks of citizenship. There were also practical arguments for democracy. Broadly, democracy was seen as providing citizens with a basis for protecting their rights, with rights increasingly taking on greater significance in early capitalist societies. Additionally, the utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill became convinced that democratic participation provided a unique avenue for the self-development of citizens. Mill was among a minority of 19th century philosophers that made that self-development argument towards women, that basically said that women have the same right to self-development as men. So let's talk a little bit about John Stuart Mill. He was one of the great 19th century philosophers, one of my favorite philosophers of the 19th century. He variously described himself as a liberal, as a socialist, as a utilitarian. And what exactly is a utilitarian? It's a branch of liberal and socialist philosophy that basically argues that we should be pursuing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, that is a view that has to be leavened, again, with protection of minority rights, because you could make the argument that the greatest good for the greatest number would be for all blue-eyed people to be subjected to slavery. That is sort of a basic problem with utilitarianism. There is also the problem that its moral psychology is informed by what we describe as hedonism. And that is this notion that happiness are those things that produce pleasure, and those things that produce pain are those things that we should avoid. So Mill again asks a question: would despotic monarchy be the best government? Mill basically says that the idea of a virtuous despot has enthralled philosophers going back to the Greeks. Both certainly Plato believed that the best form of government would be that of a philosopher king, a person who combined philosophical rigor and intellectual weight with the other kind of kingly abilities. Mill basically argues that is too great a concession to make, to say, oh yeah, a good despot would be the best form of government. He's basically saying that no one person has all the virtues necessary to be a wise ruler. That the things that make a person good at one thing, good at war, good at domestic policy, good at any other number of things, might render them less good at other things. But again, the problem is, it takes more than simply being virtuous. It takes more than being benevolent. A despot would also need to be omniscient. And that is too much to expect of any ruler. So the more you see people saying, well, one person ought to be in charge, you should be a little skeptical of that. It's rare to see multiple forms of genius combined in one person. And it's all too often that we see that people who are very good in one area are not so good in others when they try their hand. Think of Elon Musk, for example. His genius is very similar actually to Donald Trump's genius, which mainly is he's really good at self-promotion. And he's also good at coming into companies, taking them over, and tapping the right people to do things, and then enriching himself. He's good at that. Is he a good CEO of Twitter, of X? I think most people would say he's very nearly destroyed that social media platform. Was he a good leader of Doge? Was he leader of Doge? They were very dodgy about that Doge thing. Perhaps most importantly, the problem is that in a despotism, there is at most only one patriot, right? And most people are secretly kind of wishing for the despot to fail, because most people think that despots are too big for their britches. So Mill makes the argument again that the food of feeling is action. Even domestic affection lives upon voluntary good offices. He is tapping into something very important in human nature, that we are innately sociable beings. We want to be part of a community. We want to be valuable parts of the community. Instinctively, most people gravitate towards things that other people need within a community. More importantly, Mill says, let a person have nothing to do for his country, and he will not care for it. Right? Remember John F. Kennedy's famous line, ask not what you can do for or ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. He was tapping into that idea that voluntarism is an important basis of citizenship. So the ideal form of government is one in which the sovereignty or supreme controlling power of the last resort is vested in the entire aggregate of the community. In other words, popular sovereignty. So he advocates two organizing principles. One, the rights and interests of every or any person are only secure from being disregarded when the person interested is himself able and habitually disposed to stand up for them. Call that the principle of self-protection. Second, the general prosperity attains a greater height and is more widely diffused in proportion to the amount and variety of the personal energies enlisted in promoting it. That is, the second principle is effectively self-dependence, right? Households are best when they can provide for the means of their sustenance. When you know the breadwinners of the family, be it a male alone or a male and a female or a female alone, increasingly we see that these days. But nevertheless, whoever is making the money for that household is able to make enough money that they can pay the mortgage, they can pay for their car, they can buy gas, they can buy their groceries, they can buy clothes for their kids. Back to school is here, right? You got to go on shopping sprees for the kids to keep them happy. Those are important things. Mill asks, what kind of character is desirable, is most desirable for the common good? He contrasts passive characters versus active characters. And he makes the point that, in societies, in governments that are less than democratic, people, the political elites that govern those societies would prefer that people be passive, right? But in a democratic society, you should want people. Think back to what we talked about with Machiavelli. Machiavelli said you needed a citizenry that was imbued with virtù, with activity, with willingness, with courage, right? So while the passive character endures evil, the active character struggles against it. The passive character is acquiescent and submissive and is easily governed. Mill notes with active characters, it's much easier for the active mind to acquire the virtues of patience than for the passive one to assume those of energy. Again, what's the point? The challenge of managing active citizens is directing them, right? Not suppressing their energy, but finding an outlet for it that is useful to the common good. Mill notes, a passive, a contented character is not a potential rival. But he also notes, improvement of the human condition is wholly the work of the uncontented, of the people who strive against nature. Another important aspect of Mill's discussion of democratic kind of virtues is, he talks about three varieties of mental excellence: mental, intellectual excellence, practical excellence, and moral excellence. In each of these, it requires a certain amount of energy and of activity. You think about intellectual excellence and you think, well, that's just people thinking thoughts. But real intellectual excellence demands serious thought and engagement with reality, not simply dreaming. Practical excellence involves struggling with natural powers and tendencies to find solutions that improve life. And importantly, moral excellence. He says, yeah, I can see where you think that submission to God is somehow sufficient to say you're morally excellent. But more is required. Moral excellence is not mere contentment or mere submission, but it's active and self-helping and self-developing and is aspiring to more than seeming or appearing to be good, but in actually being and doing good. Nothing is more likely for Mill to produce excellence in all three dimensions of a person than giving people public responsibilities. The idea that people share in public responsibilities is to Mill the greatest aspect of the, the kind of the moral development that occurs in democratic communities. So let's talk about, again, democracy as an ideal and as its less than ideal practice. So again, we noted in the earlier presentation that democracy is an essentially contested concept with practical challenges in application. So as an ideal, democracy has at times enjoyed near consensus support as a governing principle. In that sense, democracy is idealized along with such virtues as true love, inner peace, and natural beauty. Again, the challenge, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, democracy in practice is only as good as the people practicing it. When people say citizens should have power, but they also say citizens are only about 10% of the actual polity and the rest of people have no voice, that is democratic, but it's not very democratic, paradoxically, right? How you set the rules determine how broad, what does it mean? Democracy is about we, right? Who do we consider to be Americans? If you draw that circle broadly, then it can be very inclusive. If you draw it too narrowly, though, you're excluding large numbers of people. Now, again, we get a lot of this, argument with undocumented immigration. And I believe we should have borders, and I believe that people should follow a process to become citizens. But I also think that some of the best citizens are people who have come here voluntarily, who have learned, about the culture, who understand our government and how our political institutions work, and who are prepared to work hard, to be Americans. Our immigrant communities are a source of strength to me. So democracy in theory, is again occluded by the fact that democracy is being practiced by human beings. Both ancient Athens and the antebellum southern states believed passionately in slavery. They believed that it was their right as white men, or as Athenians, if you will, to enslave other people, to reduce people, to subject them to servitude, involuntary servitude. And they justified that on the basis that, on the one hand, they believed, in the South, that black people were simply degraded, that they were subhuman. But on the other hand, they basically made the argument that they were superior to other people. It's important to keep in mind that, I was born in 1963. When I was born, 16 states still had miscegenation laws on the books in their states. Miscegenation is interracial marriage. 16 states banned interracial marriage well into the 1960s, until the Supreme Court held in Loving v. Virginia that miscegenation, that anti-miscegenation laws were unconstitutional, that people had the right to marry whoever they wanted. These are the challenges that you have to overcome to approach, democracy. And again, we're talking about two very different problems, right? The fact that some people define democracy and say, well, I deserve democracy because I have virtue. These other people lack virtue because I say. Likewise, until 2003, many states still had on their books and still occasionally enforced anti-sodomy laws. What is sodomy? It's any kind of sex act that is not procreative. and encompasses a wide array of sexual expressions. Now, the state has in our Constitution, the state governments have a responsibility to see to the moral education of their citizens. Do we really want governments getting into people's bedrooms? Yes, we have laws against rape. Yes, we have laws against pedophilia. But what two consenting adults do in the privacy of their homes, is that really any business of the state? Should majorities be allowed to restrict the rights or otherwise discriminate against minorities? This is how democratic practice can work against democratic theory. You also have the paradox of wealth. In the United States, it is increasingly expensive to campaign for public office, particularly at the federal level, but even at the state level. What are the political consequences of these increasingly high-stakes electoral competitions? It opens the door to people of great wealth being able to fundamentally rig the game. I think I mentioned in an earlier presentation, Voltaire once ironically said, "God favors the big battalions." Well, in electoral politics, God oftentimes favors the candidate with the larger war chest. It doesn't always work that way. But as the old saying goes, why take chances? So let's talk a little bit about the problem of voter suppression. This is a brief article by Alexander Kaczor, as a Harvard University historian. And again, he notes there is a long history of voter suppression in the United States. Prior to the Civil War, most of the bases for economic voter suppression was economic in nature. Poll taxes were often levied in ways that made it impossible for low-income people to vote. You also had the sectional nature of voter suppression in the North and the South. I would note this, our party system, we have a two-party system. And prior to the Civil War, we actually had kind of both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, had northern and southern wings, and in the aftermath, even in the aftermath of the Civil War. But the incentives for voter suppression were different. In the North, they were looking to suppress immigrants. In the South, particularly after the Civil War, they were looking to suppress blacks. The all too common rationale that unifies these different kind of motivations is, and the claim that they use to justify this is that they were trying to preserve the purity of the ballot box. And again, as Kaczor notes, notably the targets of exclusionary laws have tended to be similar for more than 2 centuries. The poor immigrant, African Americans, and others, the kind of the others that are any category that you want to put forward. Asian Americans, Native Americans. Remember, Native Americans were not citizens until 1924. In this century, the GOP has been the main malefactor when it comes to voter suppression. And much of this has really occurred in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder. And again, this was a case in Alabama where Shelby County sued, and it was really Alabama that was suing the Attorney General. Because, at the time, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 required what was known as pre-clearance prior to any voting district changing their voter qualifications. The Supreme Court struck down that pre-clearance requirement, and pre-clearance was a part of the Voting Rights Act. I can't remember exactly which clause it was, but it effectively, or what title it was, but it was effectively basically saying that if you had been, if you were guilty of voter discrimination in the past, you had to go to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division prior to changing any laws. The Supreme Court struck that down and basically said that the lack of a time limitation on that restriction was unconstitutional. And again, the result was Republican-controlled states, Indiana, Texas, lots of other states, promptly, initiated strict voter ID laws. Basically, so there was only a certain number of voter identification cards that would allow you to be able to register to vote. And the practical effect of strict voter identification laws is that it routinely suppresses the votes of up to 2% of otherwise eligible voters. And who are those voters? They tend to be the elderly who may have lost their driver's license, may have lost their birth certificate in a fire or something like that. It tends to be poor people who also may not have access to a car. Oftentimes they're young people. These are all folks that are majority Democratic identifying voters. And if you wonder how the state of Texas and Florida became so solidly red, it has a lot to do with voter suppression. What are the motivations there? Well, think about the Electoral College. How many Electoral College votes does it take to get a party's nominee to the presidency? You have to win 270. Without Texas and Florida, no Republican candidate can get there. What are the effects of voter suppression and what can we do about it? Again, strict voter ID laws reduce participation of targeted groups by up to 8 to 10%, which overall, it amounts to a 2 to 3% move, which is all you need in an election. Elections in the United States are won on the margins. So what are the legal remedies? You could have automatic voter registration, right? You could loosen ID requirements. You could have an election day holiday. The fact that we hold elections, on the first Tuesday of every November, it's always a working day, and a lot of working class people, especially lower income Americans, have difficulty taking significant amounts of time off to do their civic duty. You could restore pre-clearance for state voter laws. You could also amend the Constitution. There is a UCLA law professor by the name of Richard Hasson who specializes in federal election laws. His book, A Real Right to Vote, makes the argument for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote for all eligible Americans. And again, it doesn't solve all the problems because there's always ways of pushing around, well, who constitutes eligible? This next article we're going to discuss is a guy by the name of Andrew Sullivan. He's a conservative, and he basically makes the argument that democracies end when they are too democratic. Okay? Sullivan has been an editor of the New Republic. He is a self-described Oakshottian conservative, which is a brand of cultural conservatism that we'll explore in a few weeks when we get to conservatism. But Sullivan, again, contends that when citizens lack civil virtue, they are prone to excesses that threaten democratic governance. And so Sullivan begins personally with, remembering the 2016, election, which he describes in dystopian terms. He had what he called a Socratic premonition from the Republic, from Plato's Republic. Tyranny is probably established out of no other regime than democracy. A lot of conservatives have made that argument. That, and in fact, I talked about Plato being kind of an anti-democrat. Democracy's corrosive effects destroy both shame and privilege. Under the right conditions, a tyrant can exploit democracy's defects for their personal gain. And he is basically saying that there have been weakenings of our Constitution's Republican features, those features I discussed earlier. And one of the big problems is the erosion of our sorting mechanism. There was a time when you really needed to be steeped in politics in order to have a reasonable shot at getting either party's nomination to be president. And what really began to happen over the course of the 20th century was that the sorting mechanism began to break. And you began, with the liberalization of rules, the nominating rules for primary elections, the move to primary elections themselves for the two parties, that really began producing candidates that lacked the kind of experiences that would really make them suitable to be president. And he basically sees in Donald Trump someone who is very adept at exploiting populism. And he notes Donald Trump is not from the working class. He is an elite with the common touch. Trump has assiduously cultivated the image of immense fame and success, despite his many failures in a variety of endeavors. Sullivan cites Eric Hoffer's great book, True Believer, from 1951, and the facility of certain people in the electorate for make-believe, for imagining, I say it, therefore it's true. And to him, the most powerful motivator that is driving Donald Trump's popularity is hatred. So is Donald Trump an aspiring autocrat? He was asked by Sean Hannity on Fox News, would you be a dictator? What did he say? Only on day one. Now, he jokingly said only on day one, but I really think he meant from day one. He has expressed a love for violence and, frankly, torture for its demonstration effect. During his rallies, if he saw someone protest, he would say, knock the crap out of that guy. Excuse my language. But it was the president that said that, using his direct words. One of the most notable things about Donald Trump is that he lacks self-control. He is constantly tweeting late at night, and it's been confirmed by people who have been, who have served in his administration, that's him tweeting at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. California Governor Gavin Newsom has begun basically posting on social media in the Trumpian mode. And that outraged the people at Fox News. Show some dignity. Well, he's just behaving like the current president of the United States. Trump has demonstrated consistently skill at shifting the basic terms of democratic debate into untrammeled emotion, into us versus them. Now, Sullivan has faith that elites still matter. And that's really, kind of the question that we're going to have to ask ourselves going forward. Next, let's talk a little bit about, again, how democracies die. What are some factors that lead to the erosion of democracy? When I began this conversation in the previous, my last presentation, I talked about how popular democracies were in the 1990s and how it seemed like there was a democratic wave in the offing. Today, we're seeing a contraction of democracies. Countries that have, previously moved in a democratic direction have retrenched in more autocratic directions in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. These two guys, Harvard University's political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, wrote a book called How Democracies Die that was published in 2018. Frankly, again, Levitsky, I believe, has moved out of the country. He has moved to Canada because he believes that we are in a dangerous place. And they point to the warning signs of authoritarianism that include the assaults on the guardrails that help preserve democratic societies. So they contrast. How did democracies used to die? During the Cold War and in the 20th century, you basically saw coups d'état, military takeovers, as the normal way that democracies ended. Venezuela's experience with Hugo Chavez, however, points to another less dramatic way to break a democracy. The Chavistas' democratic period from 98 to 2023, basically preceded to a period of steady norm breaking. Okay? So in the in the 20th centuries, you would see, for example, the Chilean military basically just blow things up and kill thousands of supporters of the Chilean president, including the Chilean president Salvador Allende Gozens. So the first thing you do is developing a litmus test. Extremist demagogues emerge in all societies. They exist. Once ensconced in powers, democracy confronts a second critical test: the constraint and subversion of democratic institutions. Again, while many political observers continue to have faith in these guardrails, Levitsky and Ziblatt are less confident. There are two kind of norms that are essential. The one being mutual toleration, and the other being forbearance. Now, what do I mean by toleration? I mean, effectively, that you allow people to have alternative viewpoints that you happen not to agree with. And again, increasingly we are seeing members of the Trump administration speak of Democrats as if they were illegitimate, and not as if these were democratically elected people. The second idea is the idea of forbearance, and that is the sense in which, I lost this election, but my party may win in the next cycle or the next cycle after that. Without that forbearance, without that willingness to endure what you may disagree with, it makes it really hard to have a durable democratic regime. So what are the four indicators of authoritarian behavior? One, rejection or weak commitment to democratic rules of the game. Do they reject the Constitution or express a willingness to violate it? Donald Trump did in the aftermath of the 2020 elections. Again, on social media, he said there are times when we have to set aside the Constitution. Two, denial of the legitimacy of political appointments. Do they describe their rivals as subversive or opposed to the existing Constitution? Trump has repeatedly done that. Tolerance of or encouragement of violence. Do they have any ties to armed gangs, paramilitary forces, militias, guerrillas, or other organizations that engage in illicit violence? Answer that question for yourself. 4, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Trump has sued media repeatedly. Have they supported laws or policies that restrict civil liberties, such as expanded libel or defamation laws? Trump has made liberal use of defamation laws. He's argued for restricting protests. He's occupied American cities, but particularly those cities with Democratic mayors, and particularly those cities with black mayors. He's threatening to send troops to Chicago. He has troops in Washington, D.C. What can be done to keep authoritarian figures from power? First of all, political parties have to engage in successful gatekeeping. You have to distance yourself from those elements that you suspect of harboring authoritarian beliefs. One thing that was very worrisome in the German recent elections where the Christian Democrats took power was that you had a avowedly pro-Nazi party on the right that was, kind of making overtures. You actually had Elon Musk speak out in support of that group. Christian Democrats to date have basically kept their distance from that party. Parties should root out their own extremists within their ranks. That's something that the Republican Party did in the 1950s and 60s. They got rid of the John Birch Society. They basically said, no, we can't support you. You're not part of the club. Pro-democratic parties have to avoid alliances with anti-democratic parties and candidates. Again, allegiances of convenience with anti-democratic parties, you have to resist that temptation. The short-term gain is almost certainly going to be far outweighed by the long-term pain. Pro-democratic parties should seek to isolate rather than legitimize extremists. You should avoid normalizing extremism. Think about, down in Brazil. They've actually arrested their former president because he was attempting to foment a coup against the current socialist government. And Trump has actually levied high tariffs on Brazil for that reason, basically intruding into Brazil's domestic politics because he claims that their pursuit of the former president is a witch hunt. Does that sound familiar? Has he taken it personally? Viewing it through the lens of his own experiences? Finally, when extremists emerge as serious contenders, mainstream parties should seek to forge a united front to defeat them. Those are the things that you can do. But again, it requires effort. You've got to work at it, and you've got to avoid the temptation of capitalizing on whatever instability they may be creating. So let's talk about the three conceptions of democracy that we kind of see in the world today. Again, democracy as a concept is filtered in different ways by different ideologies. So on the one hand, you have liberal democracy, which is, again, it is a focus on individual rights, on due process, on Republican government. Social democracy tends to be focused on those kind of egalitarian, arguments, on policies to try and reduce poverty. And then finally, you have the paradoxical people's democracy, where an elitist vanguard party is making the argument, we're governing in the interests of the people. They're just not ready to take power yet. So when you compare democracy from a liberal versus a socialist perspective, you see some some real differences. And this is important. A lot of people in American parlance make the effort to try and collapse the concepts. Liberalism and socialism are really distinctive. There's a phrase that I use on this slide, sine qua non. It's Latin for without which not. And so for liberalism, the sine qua non is personal liberty. For socialism, the sine qua non is equality. When they talk about rule within democracy, you're talking about rule by rights-bearing individuals with liberal democracy. With socialism, it is rule directed to establish and maintain a rough equality of resources, where the government is going to have a significant role in the economy. In liberal democracy, certain rights cannot be abridged. Chief among those unalienable rights are, again, freedom of expression and the right to own property. Keep in mind, liberalism emerges as a defense of capitalism. For socialism, it is equality of opportunity that requires the extension of democracy into the realm of economics. Workplace democracy. The third variant is, again, people's democracy, and that is closer to the ancient Greek idea of democracy. Government as being responsive to the will of the proletariat. And again, that is kind of paradoxical. It's something that Marx talked about, the dictatorship of the proletariat. For people's democracy, they argue that America and Europe are basically governed by a bourgeois, by the rulers, by the owners of industry. and they exploit the workers. When we get later in the semester and we're talking about socialism, in particular about Marxism, I'll elaborate on this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and what that's required. On this slide, you actually see a poster from 1912 by the Hungarian socialist artist Biro Mihály expressing solidarity with the idea of people's democracy. So does democracy require tolerance? It's important to keep in mind that ideology is more than ideals. It is fundamentally action-driven. And so what is the relationship between democratic practice and tolerance? And the argument you're going to find, and I think it's a persuasive one, democratic practice cannot long survive in an atmosphere of intolerance. At the same time, intolerance, is difficult to tolerate if you believe in democracy, right? If people are campaigning saying we're going to get rid of this democracy, well, should you tolerate that? Is America increasingly intolerant? I think we have always had bursts of intolerance, and that has oftentimes occasioned large numbers of immigrants coming into this country. But from the rise of talk radio in the 1980s to the increasing influence of social media, what we call them influencers, we are seeing more and more intolerance being expressed, more racism, more anti-Semitism. You're seeing more and more these people, people are willing, there's a group of developers in Arkansas basically saying we want to create a community where we can deny you access to a home in this neighborhood if you're not white. Imagine, 20 years ago, that would have been impossible. Increasingly, we have partisan-dominated state governments pursuing culture war agendas, bans on, transgender care, where parents want to do something for their children, and the medical community wants to do something for those children. And politicians are saying, for ideological reasons, no, we don't believe that you should be allowed to do that. What we're seeing is what is known as affective polarization, where we basically say, yeah, I'm not that keen on my side, but I hate the other side. I want to destroy the other side. That is the problem we confront in this country. How can we work to create a politics where we can, kind of push through this mutual antipathy and get back to a realm where we can tolerate one another. Live and let live. You may think that same-sex marriage is morally repugnant, but it neither picks your pocket nor breaks your leg if your next-door neighbor is married, if your male next-door neighbor has a husband rather than a wife. It simply doesn't affect you. Why should you care? We need to pick our fights. We need to be careful. And we live in very dangerous times. So, when we come back, we will begin exploring the idea. The first of our ideologies that we'll really begin to explore is liberalism, which is really one of the formative ideology of the modern era. Okay? So, I'll see you next time.